for the warm introduction. It's great being here on your beautiful campus today, and it's a great pleasure to be a part of your Modern China lecture series. As Dr. Murray, my friend Jeremy just introduced, I'll be talking today about two films, one from Taiwan, namely Café Lumière, and one from mainland China, Riding Alone for Thousands of Miles. Now, I have to say that I absolutely love the film Café Lumière, and I've probably lost all academic objectivity when it comes to this film because I love it so much. And in contrast to my own affection for this movie, typically my students dislike the film, to put it lightly. Has anyone in this group seen the film already? Do we have anyone who's seen it? All right. So it's my pleasure to introduce it to you, but it's a film that my students in world cinema classes often find to be quite slow-moving. Some students even say it's dull. They say it's like looking at a painting. And in my experience, when I watch this, it's like a painting that moves, right? What if you went to a museum and the painting started moving? It's fascinating. And so I absolutely love this film. It's a great pleasure to introduce this film to you today. I'll be putting this film in comparison with Zhang Yimou's Riding Alone for Thousands of Miles. And I'm grateful to Brian Hu, the art director of the San Diego Asian Film Festival, who recommended I put these two films into comparison in order to see some of the interesting ways that Hsiao-Hsien represents aesthetics and character desire in his film, Café Lumière. So when we introduce these two films, we instantly get into a political discussion, don't we? We can't simply, in a vacuum, compare these two artistic works because recognizing the discourses from these two regions leads to very interesting conflicting views. If you Google China, as I did in preparation for this lecture today, and look at the Google image search results, you'll find an image such as this, in which the mainland is shaded orange, and yet we can see that Taiwan, the island off the coast of China, is not shaded. And in this way, we have a recognition that Taiwan stands alone as an independent country, and that China is separate from Taiwan as a nation state. And yet, in the same search results in Google Images, we find a map such as this one, in which Taiwan is shaded the same color as mainland China. And in this way, it recognizes that Taiwan is a province of mainland China. So we enter into a political discourse as soon as we initiate these type of cross-strait analyses. In addition, we can note certainly current cross-strait tensions. We know that when, at the time, President-elect Donald Trump had a phone conversation with President Tsai of Taiwan, it created international reaction. The Guardian writes in their headline, "Trump's phone call with Taiwan president risks China's wrath." As reported in the article, it was the first time that there was a state-to-state conversation between a president or president-elect and a Taiwan president since 1979. Another issue in cross-strait relations today includes the South China Sea. And again, just doing a quick search before initiating today's lecture, it wasn't difficult to find numerous headlines, including this one, South China Sea, Japan and Taiwan send their own strong messages to Beijing, as this maritime issue is currently a hotspot in global politics. So not only do we enter into a discussion in comparing these films that deals with current events, but each of these films from Taiwan and China emerge from anti-Japanese war film tradition films. And so the fact that we find these sympathetic portrayals leads us to recognize the unique qualities of these films and enables, in this case, hopefully for you, a very interesting analysis, as I know it is certainly for me. And then as a result of this comparison, I'd like to reveal a few tentative conclusions that not only deal with the nature of these two films, but also the nature of cross-strait relations and the way that we can see the psychology of both Taiwan and China represented in these two works. After all, Theodor Adorno wrote in 1949 in a book on new music, The Philosophy of New Music, he says the forms of art reflect the history of a people more truthfully than documents themselves. This reminds me of Darrell William Davis's book, Picturing Japaneseness, in which he states, sometimes we watch movies and we find it fascinating that they correlate with the historical moment, and we take interest in recognizing this correlation. But Davis writes, no, this sells films short. Films themselves are primary documents of history. And in this way, he echoes Adorno, who states that they're the most truthful way of recognizing what a culture or society believes at a particular or evokes at a particular point in time. What initially fascinated me about Café Lumière when I watched it, and this film is by a Taiwan director who was commissioned by a Japanese film company to make a film in Japan in Japanese. It was a film that was made in homage to the Japanese director Ozu. When I encountered the film, I was stunned because the film takes place in Japan, and yet it looks so similar to Taiwan that it's virtually indistinguishable. As we see here, as trains travel across the rural landscape of Japan, it reminds me of distinct memories of Ilan County in northeast Taiwan. The topography is quite similar in the way that Hsiao-Hsien presents this. And additionally, even the urban spaces, here's Tokyo and Café Lumière, are very similar to urban spaces in Taipei, which I can acknowledge not only based on personal experience, but also in the film imagination. I took this film still from Ang Lee's film, Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, and you can see the visual correspondences there. Now, the idea that there would be visual correspondences isn't a particularly original insight. After all, when Hong Kong director Wong Kar-wai shot his gay romance film in Argentina, he used Cantonese, and he used the same film aesthetics that he used in making films in Hong Kong. So people who watch the film feel like they've watched a Hong Kong film, albeit one that takes place in Argentina. And Peggy Chow's films, a series of films in the early 2000s, were actually intentionally shot to demonstrate that multiple cities across East Asia share very similar aesthetics despite the different nations from which those cities emerge from. So in this case, we have Beijing Bicycle, a film from 2001, and you can see that it matches the imagery from Taipei in Blue Gate Crossing. And again, this was the intention of this series of films, to show the similarity in cities across Asia. But I think something is a bit more interesting happening in Café Lumière. It's not only that there's a visual correspondence that makes them, in some ways, virtually indistinguishable, but we have to keep in mind that the blurred boundaries are quite fascinating when we consider that Taiwan was a colony of Japan from 1895 to 1945. So why this ambivalent representation of a former colonizer? I take the term ambivalent from Dr. Liao Pinghui's work, and he talks about the way that Taiwan artwork shares an ambivalent quality when it represents Japan. And why is that? Why is Café Lumière absent of criticism, absent of critique? And instead, it offers us a contemplative view of Japan, as Emily Ye has written in her recent article on Café Lumière. Additionally, as mentioned before, Hsiao-Hsien's film emerges in distinction from a tradition of anti-Japanese war films in which Japanese are depicted as villains. Now, interestingly, Riding Alone for Thousands of Miles emerges from a tradition that has its own distinct anti-Japanese war film tradition. And today, relations are also fraught with ambiguity and tension in multiple arenas, including the political, historical, and geographical. So it's with this brief introduction that I'd like to move into some new areas as we compare both Café Lumière and Riding Alone. By the time that Café Lumière was released by director Hsiao-Hsien from Taiwan, he was already well established as a world cinema auteur director. In the early 80s, he was part of Taiwan's new cinema movement, and his award-winning films include City of Sadness, The Puppet Master, and Good Men, Good Women. Both The Puppet Master and Good Men, Good Women depict Taiwan under Japanese colonial rule. And in fact, in Good Men, Good Women, in one of the narratives, during Japanese occupation, Taiwanese travel to mainland China in order to fight against Japanese occupying forces. But in many ways, Café Lumière is considered a minor work in Hsiao-Hsien's filmography in contrast to these landmark films. Most recently, Hsiao-Hsien won Best Director at the Cannes Film Festival for his martial arts film, The Assassin, in 2015. Zhang Yimou also was a well-established director by the time he made Riding Alone for Thousands of Miles. His film, which won the Golden Bear in 1987, Red Sorghum, ends actually with a very violent interaction between Japanese and Chinese in the end of that film, followed by Judo and Raise the Red Lantern, which established Zhang Yimou as one of the leading so-called Chinese fifth-generation directors. His most recent film, which you may have encountered, is The Great Wall. The blockbuster The Great Wall is Zhang Yimou's most recent film, starring Matt Damon. So that takes us into a very different conversation regarding current Hollywood and Chinese connections and blockbusters, et cetera. But the film that he released after establishing himself as a world cinema auteur includes Riding Alone for Thousands of Miles. So these works are a little bit less representative of the major works of these directors, but I think with a little bit of historical hindsight and the way that the film narratives capture the psychology of an era, I'm convinced that these are really valuable films that are worth a comparative analysis. And fortunately, recent work by Emily Ye and a wonderful article by Wendy Larson on Riding Alone for Thousands of Miles are keeping these films within the landscape in academia and other discourses. Let's consider the anti-Japanese war tradition from which these films emerge. In Taiwan, the anti-Japanese war films were most pronounced and prominent in the 1970s. At this political juncture, Taiwan had lost prestige. Their international prestige had waned in multiple arenas, and seemingly in a response to this, the Taiwan nationalist state government transitioned from an era of literary art films to counter or resist Japanese films. Now, these films demonstrated victorious nationalist armies on the silver screen in a moment politically and culturally, again, when their prestige was waning internationally. These films include The Everlasting Glory, 800 Heroes, Victory, and A Teacher of Great Soldiers. Oftentimes, these films were set during the Second Sino-Japanese War, and this allowed the narratives to portray nationalist armies victorious over Japanese aggression and Japanese aggressors. One interesting aspect of this comparative project, in my view, is that while the era of anti-Japanese war films was quite pronounced in the 1970s, and it was part of the mainland Chinese consciousness as well, it's far more pronounced today in mainland China. So my point is that it seems as if the era that was in Taiwan that depicted anti-Japanese war films, so about 4 decades ago, that moment is front and center today in mainland Chinese films. In a widely distributed AP News article in 2012, it was recorded that over 200 anti-Japanese war films, or anti-Japanese films, were made in that year alone. Included in that figure of 200 films is director Feng Xiaogang's Back to 1942, and The Flowers of War, which is also another Zhang Yimou film. He returned to this provocative period piece, in this case starring the Western star Christian Bale. Vivian Lee, in her study of these recent anti-Japanese war films on the mainland, describes it in this way. The atrocities inflicted on the Chinese people during the Second Sino-Japanese War have had a lasting impact on the national psyche. To this day, this national wound remains visible in the Chinese cinematic imagination. One very interesting aspect of these anti-Japanese war films is the appeal to universal values. In fact, Christian Bale and director Zhang Yimou both stated after the release of The Flowers of War that the film appeals to universal values of humanitarianism, of benevolence, of redemption, And yet, unmistakably, the Japanese are the villains in these films, right? And this is similar to what we would expect in other world cinema traditions. For example, portrayals of the Nazis in French World War II films, or even portrayals of the Middle East in Hollywood cinema today. Now, certainly there are variations on this theme. In the year 2000, Jiang Wen directed a film, Devils on the Doorstep, and it depicted three-dimensional figures on both sides, both the Japanese and the Chinese peasants. Now, as a result of producing and directing this film, of which he won international prestige, he was actually banned from filmmaking in China for 7 years. And the rationale was that, ostensibly, that the film was inefficiently patriotic. Now, again, interestingly, if we compared this to Taiwan in the 1970s, I'm sure the same fate would await a director in Taiwan in the 70s had they also offered a type of three-dimensional or sympathetic portrayal of the Japanese. Now, as a quick aside, I have to say that Jiang Wen is Baze Malbus in Rogue One, and as a big Star Wars fan and a fan of Jiang Wen, I couldn't have had a better marriage. It's a match made in heaven to have both one of my film heroes and the Star Wars universe combined, so I have to add that quickly as an aside. In terms of the variations on the theme, in Taiwan, we recently see a number of films in which the ambivalent relationship with Japan is presented. The highest grossing film in Taiwan up to the point of its release, Cape No. 7, which was released in 2008, features a romantic relationship during the colonial era of a Japanese man and a woman from Taiwan. And a bit more recently, Kano is a film that's made in Taiwan, but it's almost entirely in Japanese. It depicts a 1931 baseball team from Chiayi, and it's based on historical records. This actually happened. That a team from Taiwan in Chiayi, they nearly won the entire Japanese baseball championship in 1931. And so the film, almost entirely in Japanese, depicts in a very fluid manner the adventures and the ups and downs of this baseball team in Taiwan in 1931, and indeed their competitions in Japan as the young baseball team travels to Tokyo for the championships. So this project's comparative method, turning to the way the film analyses themselves work, is based on an approach I use for every film project that I initiate. Namely, if I want to understand the way a film works, one of my first steps is to create a sequence breakdown of the entire film. And so I watch the film the first time, almost as a rule. I want to enjoy films. I still love films, even though I study them for a living. And so the first time I watch a movie, I want to eat popcorn, and I want to sit back, and I want to relax and enjoy it. But once I determine this is a film I really want to study, and I want to write an article about it, I want to write a book about it, I create a list of the characters in the film, the various narratives that the film portrays, and then sequence by sequence through the entire film, I record which characters are present, which narratives are being represented, and then I offer my own observations and highlights in terms of the film techniques and the film aesthetics. Typically a film that runs around 90 minutes, as Café Lumière does, has about 30 to 36 sequences. So it is a manageable project to outline the entire film. It usually takes me about 8 film viewings to complete one of these documents, at which case I feel that I have an understanding of the film that can lead me next to offer, in this case, a comparative analysis, or in the case of analyzing one film, start to recognize its patterns. So here's my sequence breakdown of writing alone for thousands of miles. And again, it gives me a chance to, in essence, reverse engineer the film to see how all of its parts fit together, and then put them back together in order to understand the director's ideas for the film, but also the aesthetic techniques and the nature of the character desire in the film. So with that comparative method and project in place, I would like to share some of those results with you here in terms of a narrative summary. Now, as many of my students suggest to me in their written responses to the film, nothing happens in Café Lumière, they say. And maybe for this reason, it's quite easy and simple to briefly summarize the film. Yoko, who's the main character in Café Lumière, a young woman, a strong protagonist, she is in Tokyo. She has a research project, which is the Taiwan composer Zhang Wenye, who was a Taiwanese composer who studied in Japan during the colonial era in the 1930s. So she researches this composer, and that's basically it. She visits her friends, she goes to coffee shops, and there's at least 3 moments of sheer cinematic genius that occurs in the film, I would argue. But the narrative is very easy to summarize. In contrast to the slice of life depiction in Café Lumière, Riding Alone for Thousands of Miles is very dramatic. It's an emotional roller coaster. It depicts a Japanese man named Takada. He travels to China from Japan in order to film an opera. He has a son who he's estranged from, and his son is dying, he's passing away. And so the father, in this last effort to make amends with his son, travels to China to film an opera which he knows is very significant to his son. Along the way, he meets a boy who teaches him what it means to be a good father. Since the narratives are quite straightforward, what interests me far more than the organization of the narrative is the portrayal of the characters and the techniques that each director uses to depict the character desire as well as the narrative flow of each of these stories. In Café Lumière, the main character, Yoko, she's a strong, independent woman. She has a child that she has with her Taiwanese boyfriend, and her parents don't want her to keep the baby, but being strong-willed as she is, she decides to keep the child. She talks with her friend, in this case, Hajime, one of her friends. In this case, they're listening to a CD. They're listening to Zhang Wenye's music. She researches, she has dreams, she researches and reads in her free time, discusses with her parents as she moves through the city streets of Tokyo. A dominant aesthetic technique that's used is the soundtrack that's entirely comprised of the music of Zhang Wenye. There's no original soundtrack for the movie, but rather this Taiwan composer who made his music in Japan in the 1930s. In many ways, in tranquil and peaceful ways, this piano music links a series of the film sequences. Riding Alone, in terms of character desire and aesthetic techniques, is a bit different. We find a film that projects mainland China on a grand scale. Takada, in this particular image, is in the van. He's in this van traveling across the mainland Chinese landscape with his interpreter and tour guide. But we can see from this image that he's a small figure in the majestic Chinese landscape. And this is accented in terms of film aesthetics by lens filters or post-production techniques which further heighten and dramatize the sky. We can see the color palette is quite vast, and in contrast to this grand landscape, we have Takada, who's ventured from Japan to China to encounter China in all of its majesty and beauty. So with a number of these components in place, we can start to approach some tentative conclusions in terms of this comparative project's goals. In this project, and considering that it's a transnational comparative approach, we take into account the film narratives themselves in each of these films, the aesthetics used to heighten and reveal the way the narratives are organized, as well as the desire of the characters. We keep in mind what the characters are pursuing and the extent to which they're prevented or successful in achieving those goals. The films emerge from distinct anti-Japanese war film traditions. The directors have their own filmographies of which these films are part. And then we have the political tensions that are also part of the discussion. And this is, as an aside, one of the reasons why I love film studies so much is that there's so many moving pieces, and it's a great pleasure to see, even if it's a tentative conclusion that's reached, to see the way these films function, especially when they're such impressive and enjoyable works of art to appreciate. So let's move to the first of these three conclusions. The first regards what I call a mundane specificity, a very material, day-to-day representation. And as I turn to the conclusion, I'm going to read the final portions of my paper. In Café Lumière, Taiwan and Japan share multiple connections in addition to the visual and geographical architectural similarities that instigated this investigation. The protagonist, Yoko, had lived in Taiwan. She has a Taiwanese boyfriend who is the father of her as of yet unborn child. She returns to Taiwan to visit her boyfriend and purchase gifts from Taiwan for her friends in Tokyo. She researches a Taiwanese composer whose music remains influential in the present. While it certainly avoids representations of traumatic memories of a colonial past, the film does not ignore history. For example, Yoko gives her friend Hajime, depicted in this image here, a souvenir pocket watch from Taiwan, which commemorates the founding of railways in Taiwan during the colonial era. The film also looks to the future, considering Yoko's pregnancy. Each of these interactions with Taiwan occur in time and place, due to specific choices that Yoko makes. And while each aspect taken individually may seem insignificant because of the elliptical structure of the story, over the course of the film's duration, a steady pattern of exchange, contact, and interaction between Japan and Taiwan emerges. Yoko's travel and research inextricably links both locales in the story. The past is part of the present, and the present is part of the past. Yoko moves back and forth between Japan and Taiwan without anyone's blood boiling or their hearts melting. It is what it is. In contrast to this depiction, in contrast to the mundane specificity of Yoko's existence in Café Lumière, in writing alone for thousands of miles, Takada learns a number of universal truths, which brings to mind actually the appeal to universal truth in the anti-Japanese war films as well. Here are some of the universal truths that Takada encounters. Nature is a site for reflection. Fathers should be on good terms with their sons. Opera performers on the stage wear masks that mirror the ways people put on airs to hide their true feelings in real life, and so on. Wendy Larson, in her wonderful inquiry into the nature of performance in Writing Alone, writes that at its finale, the film turns, quote, into a celebration of universal human attachment, end quote. With this in mind, perhaps Takada's story reaches a successful resolution due to the fact that he learns that universal values common to all people are still adhered to in China. Consequently, he returns to his own homeland in Japan, carrying this profound insight. And this leads to a second observation, namely the shared connections between Japan and Taiwan today. And this works in contrast to China being a source of enlightenment in Writing Alone. We can see in this way that artwork, and we can consider artwork as we think about and reflect on this particular observation. Artwork plays an important role in both films. In Café Lumière, the material, circumstantial, and particular connections between Taiwan and China are complemented by the appeals of Zhang Wenye's music, which links Taiwan and Japan. And it also links the international community, since one of the compositions by Zhang Wenye won a prize at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Similarly, in Writing Alone, Takada leaves Japan in order to explore the appeal of Chinese operas, which had captivated his son. But whereas the transnational music of Zhang Wenye links Taiwan and Japan, the opera performance from Romance of the Three Kingdoms in the Chinese movie Writing Alone is an example of a local Chinese artistic expression. The performance of a Yunnan opera also has a transnational appeal, certainly, but the way it links China and Japan in the film is by way of Takada, who travels to this source and then returns to his home country, having experienced its impact. And this leads then to the third and final observation that I would like to share today. And that is that we find a profound psychological distance in these two films, even though we find in both of them an attempt to portray the characters and their relationships with Japan in a harmonious manner. This reminds me of an article that came out in Salon in November of 2016. And the headline of this article is that Russia and America talk about Syria using different narrative strategies, and it's causing harm. The idea in this essay, or this article in Salon, isn't necessarily new to the study of narrative, the study of narratology, but it's particularly pertinent at this historical juncture. If a group of people use a particular narrative that doesn't communicate due to the lack of common ground, then ultimately it's impossible for that message to be received. This can work on a national level, but maybe you've experienced this individually. You're talking to someone and your mouth is moving and they appear to be listening perhaps, but the message isn't received. And oftentimes this occurs because the person we're communicating with has their own narrative playing in their own mind, and it's difficult to receive an alternative or different message. So let's imagine that sincere political effort to reduce tensions in the East Asian region were to be put into motion by people motivated by the models of goodwill presented in both of these films. Arguably, the political action that would be inspired by Taiwan's Café Lumière, in which Yoko bases her decisions on mutually advantageous connections shared between Japan and Taiwan, would come into conflict with the political actions inspired by the Chinese film Riding Alone, in which Takada makes his movements only by the approval of state bureaucratic offices when he's in China, and concludes with the acceptance of transcendent truths that he attains within China's borders. The gulf between these two positions reveals that efforts to achieve regional agreement might clash due to their basis on widely disparate premises. This gulf is one that is sustained in narratives in film, but it's also located in a number of arenas, including the academic, political, and economic circles. The psychological distance between Taiwan and China is such that even conceptions of harmonious relations with their northeastern neighbor take very different forms. Thank you, everyone. Yes, please. Absolutely. You know, right now in Beijing, there's a conference being held. It's the 9th time that there's been a film exchange between Taiwan film directors and directors in China. And one of the most famous directors in Taiwan, named Li Xing, he heads this program each year. And every time he introduces the conference, he mentions that this is a way of creating mutual ties and bonds. And so I think absolutely that film is a way of creating those ties and connections. What fascinates me is that oftentimes when we talk about cross-strait relations in terms of politics and military, et cetera, the artistic circles is separate. And I think that a discussion like this moves the artistic discussion front and center. And I would even advocate as far as including scholars in literature, history, and film to be part of those political discussions, as their insights with these truthful documents could be equally, if not more profound. So yes, absolutely, I would agree with that.
I completely agree, and I think that what you're getting at is probably a transdisciplinary sort of conference where you can create maybe even, other social sciences to participate in this sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Because we're all working with people and we all want to better, policy or health or what have you. And the more interdisciplinary teachings and more culturally sensitive trainings there are, I think that we would be able to get a lot more done.
Yeah. And I totally agree, and this is one of the reasons why I ultimately transitioned initially as an undergrad in literature to film, because film includes such a wide variety of participants. You have capital, you have investors, you have the scientific studies, right? Film is all about recent technological innovations, as any blockbuster reveals to us, and then you have the cultural, emotional aspect. But I like where you're going, because even film studies isn't broad enough, right? We need to be cross-disciplinary and break down the silos even between departments on our campuses.
And on that note, I think that the overarching umbrella that you're probably trying to get at is art.
Yeah, and
Expression of humanity.
you hit the nail on the head, and it will be no surprise to you that I think everyone's an artist. Thank you for the question. Yes, please.
So I watched a lot of Chinese movies and films, and I know for Republican era, the
Yeah.
Japanese are always vilified.
Absolutely.
Any examples, or do you think it'd be possible to have where there's any like Chinese or Taiwanese made Republican era film where the Japanese aren't vilified?
No, it's very rare, and I think that, and I can't think of any off the top of my head. So my thinking's along the same lines as yours, and I would even go as far as to say that such sympathetic portrayals would have political, if not worse, repercussions, including in Taiwan. It would include artists that would portray the communists sympathetically or the Japanese sympathetically. This almost inevitably led to imprisonment. And so there were severe consequences for such a view. And in this way, I think we can see a very clear difference between Taiwan and mainland China today when we see so many films that openly reflect on the colonial era. But no, I can't think of examples from the Republican era due to the reasons you mentioned.
Because both of the movies you showed us, they were both modern examples.
That's right.
So I wanted to ask you, do you think the only way we can have this meeting between Japan and China would be by using modern films rather than historical?
Well, I think, yes, I would say, I would agree with that. And not only that, but I project, if the Taiwan film industry is any indication, then, and although this is not one of my main conclusions, this is something I'm still thinking about, and this is merely a suggestion at this point. But in comparing the two industries, it would appear that mainland China's industry is 4 decades behind in terms of these reflective, contemplative reevaluations and reassessments, right? So that's why I use a modern film in the present, but I'm projecting what it might be like in the future if there is an opening and a possibility to have more films like Zhang Wen's film, Devil's on the Doorstep, which is an amazing, outstanding black and white film, which I highly recommend. That's unique in its portrayal. Thanks for the question. Yeah, highly recommended.
I can only Devil's at the Doorstep.
Yep.
That's a devastating film.
It is. It is. It's heavy.
Can I ask you a question?
Please do.
You used the phrase character desire
Yeah.
in your analysis. Is
Yeah.
that something from literature studies or film studies that cuts to the quick of authorial voice, or you used it so easily, and it seems like it's a term of art.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, certainly. In terms of character desire, it follows in film studies Lacan, right, which was building his work on Freud. So it's looking at film from a psychoanalytical perspective. And to me, it's one of the most pleasurable methods of analysis, but also one of the clearest ways of gauging a character's motivation, considering what their end desire is. For example, you can look at the character's desire in terms of eros, right? What stimulates them, what keeps them going, what's their goal. You can look at the character in terms of thanatos, which is a closure, a search for some kind of ending and meaning ultimately at the end of the piece. And so, for example, in the case of Yoko, looking at her character desire, she never actually achieves enlightenment. She never finds an incredible resource that illuminates Zhang Wenye. She doesn't fall in love. There's no, certainly there's no car chases or explosions or something of this nature. And so her desire just ends when the film ends. In contrast, we can see, in terms of these representations, a clear sense of a desire for closure in the life of Takada in Writing Alone. And so this type of approach, looking at the film from a psychoanalytical perspective, allowed me in this particular case to recognize some of those similarities and differences, absolutely. And I've had other film inquiries where I've exclusively used that approach, but in this comparative project I drew upon it as well as other theoretical approaches to film analysis. Yeah. Yes, please.
So with that film analysis in that method, is it more of like a film psychology?
Yeah.
So is it more like a qualitative kind of reaction, like where you get like the sub themes, or do you get these desires after you watch the movie, or do you have like a set of categories or set of desires that you have, or like a broad spectrum, then you go into watching it?
Let's see. I think that of the two options, I'm quite neutral in approaching the film, and perhaps more closely following the lead of psychology as a discipline. I want to see and hear the characters project their own perspectives and desires, and then I record them as a result of that, and note, especially on multiple viewings, the goal that they're headed towards, and then the ways in which that goal or desire is inhibited or exhibited in different ways. And as a result, we can come up with some conclusions, such as the admirable strong-willed qualities of Yoko, as she offers in terms of self-determination, her course of action. So, yeah, thank you.
So impressive that when you really love something that you're studying, you take this incredible amount of time. This reminded me of some charts I've seen that Jeremy Brown makes in his research. You know, this is so thorough and exhaustive that you can engage. It's inspiring. It makes me want to get back into my research. And it's always just such a horizontal file, and everything's just scattered everywhere.
Right.
But you've got this really excellent approach. Really inspiring.
I'm thankful for the inspiration and instruction that I've had in earning a film studies degree, and that includes a lot of background. Maybe this is a more careful answer to your question. It takes a lead from semiotic and linguistic analysis, and thinking through desire as well as film narrative in terms of a grammatical structure and how all those pieces fit together. And so it's with this inspiration that I try to chart both the characters and their trajectory as well as the multiple narrative trajectories in the text. So.
Can you talk about Zhang a little bit? Because we actually mentioned Great Wall in our class.
Okay.
And Hero.
Okay.
Hsiao-Hsien.
Yeah.
And this film comes after Hero, which is a kind of pivotal
Yeah.
shift for him into the
Right.
blockbuster mode.
Yeah.
And well, tell us a little bit about Zhang Yimou and his trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. So Zhang Yimou is a extremely inspirational figure. He was a photographer during the Cultural Revolution. And as universities opened up after the Cultural Revolution and started accepting students, he sent in his photographs that he'd taken to the Beijing Film Academy. And he was a bit older than the typical applicant. I think he was around 28 years old. But his photographs were, according to the responses, just flat out unbelievable. And he was accepted into the Beijing Film Academy. In his early films, you can see the cinematography is incredible. In those early 3 films that I mentioned, almost every image you could pause it and I would make it into a poster that I'd put in my living room. It's just absolutely stunning imagery. And you can see his background as a photographer there. As he moves into the more recent era, there's a huge shift ideologically in Zhang Yimou. He directed the 2008 Olympics opening ceremony. And his films, we can see as he becomes much more closely associated with the party, we see far less critiques of the government that was part of his early work, and far more complicity in his more recent films. The 2002 film Hero was, I think, the highest grossing film in China up to that point, a martial arts film. And so I think that in considering all of this trajectory, Writing Alone is a little bit of a unique film, and similar to Café Lumière with Hsiao-Hsien, received less finances at the box office, fewer international awards. It's a minor project, so to speak, that sits a bit interestingly within that overall trajectory. But I think that once he became aligned with the party, his films are very complicit with state policy, including Writing Alone, which projects itself as an art house melodramatic film, but in many ways it still conforms to the party line. And very interestingly, Takata, when he goes through the film, he constantly goes to these bureaucratic offices who grant him access to these various regions. And you can see the lack of critique in each of these exchanges, even in such a very recent film. So,
that
yeah.
last thing that you said, that's fascinating because that's where it fits into his scope.
That's right.
Things don't usually work that way.
Right.
At the bureaucratic office.
Well, also when you consider that he appeals to universal values in both his anti-war film or anti-Japanese war films and this melodramatic film, you see how this is can avoid censorship among other artistic strategies. But of course, his films are widely accepted and praised. Maybe not so much The Great Wall, which is an entirely different discussion, but one that's very relevant currently in Hollywood, absolutely. So, yes?
Why do you think China is so many decades behind the way they're producing their films?
I think that the political apparatus of which film is a part, right? And that's one of the points I hope I was clear about in the presentation, that it would be impossible to just neutrally compare these two films, right? These are both works of art. Look at how the desire is different and we're done. They're situated within a political apparatus, right? And so I think certainly the way that government censorship works is one of the key factors. Absolutely, that was a factor in Taiwan in the 1970s. For example, in Taiwan at that time period, you couldn't even depict an image of Mao Zedong in any films, all right? Even if you wanted to depict the mainland, you couldn't actually even include an image of Mao Zedong, right? And that would lead to instant censorship. And yet we can see that in Taiwan's more pluralistic society today, and the opportunity for voices to speak from the margins has allowed this recent group of films in Taiwan, but we don't see that same type of openness in terms of the mainland Chinese film market. So, to the point that even a film that could attempt these type of portrayals would arguably not be released currently. So yeah, we always have to keep in mind the governmental and political when analyzing film. All right. Thank you, everyone. It's great being with you. Thanks so much.